1999 was an amazing year for PC gaming. I don't think there's any debate about that. But what is up for debate is the list of the 10 best PC games from 1999. This is going to be a controversial one. But before we get into the debate, I wanted to thank Matthias from Sweden, who has pledged the maximum amount on the Computer Gaming Yesterday Patreon. Thank you very much for your support. But that's enough introduction. Let's get right into the top 10 best PC games of 1999.
The release of BioWare's Baldur's Gate was more than the start of a legendary RPG franchise. It was also the start of a specific style of isometric 2D party-based role-playing game made possible by BioWare's Infinity Engine. Most of the games built on the Infinity Engine focused on epic stories and complex combat, but Planescape Torment took the idea in a different direction. Though it does include occasional combat, it's more of a visual novel than anything else. Torment sold slowly, no doubt due to its unusual setting and the lack of connection with other established franchises, but it generated a lot of critical praise and a cult following. The lessons learned from the game would directly impact later titles from Obsidian Entertainment, including Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2, Fallout New Vegas, and Pillars of Eternity, among many others. And more than anything, Torment proved a deeply weird, narrative-heavy role-playing game with almost no combat could not only be good, but actually great. Something I think the PC game industry of 1999, which had a tendency to rehash old generic fantasy tropes and gameplay ideas, really desperately needed. Homeworld. This was among the most anticipated PC games of 1999, and I don't think it's hard to understand why. I mean, just look at it. Homeworld was lathered in praise for its engaging story, excellent graphics, and challenging campaign. The game's voice acting, soundtrack, and cutscenes struck an emotional chord that proved strategy game campaigns and video games in general didn't have to rely on cheesy full-motion acting or over-the-top CGI to really make an impact. Despite all these strengths, Homeworld sold merely well, shifting about 500,000 units in its first 6 months. I mean, that is a lot, but it didn't keep up with other RTS games at the time. Still, this game did put Relic Entertainment on everyone's radar, and of course, Relic would rise to become a dominant force in the real-time strategy genre with titles like Dawn of War and Company of Heroes, neither of which are quite as artful as Homeworld, but it must be said they also have excellent campaigns. Those later games easily outsold Homeworld, but this is where it all began.
Reinitializing memory strings.
If this were a list of the most terrifying games released in 1999, I'm sure System Shock 2 would take the top slot. It cast players as a survivor on a starship struck by some initially unclear accident. You must piece together the mystery of the accident through a series of in-game events, complete with plenty of voice acting, lots of memos, all of which lead to one hell of a reveal. The pacing of the story and how it was told offered a unique mix of horror, action, and role-playing elements that gave System Shock 2 a sense of dread and substance, uncommon to more action-oriented first-person games, including even Valve's Half-Life, which, I mean, it's great, it's oftentimes scary, but it certainly lacked the depth of System Shock 2. Unfortunately, System Shock 2 actually did not sell very well. In fact, it might be the least popular game on this entire list, though the lack of complete data from the era makes it hard to know with absolute certainty. However, the game's legacy definitely lived on in a little spiritual successor you might have heard of called BioShock. Yeah, that game basically established the template for big-budget narrative-driven action games, and there's a very clear link between System Shock 2 to BioShock and BioShock Infinite, all the way up to modern popular games like Control and Prey.
Three frags left.
Well, I doubt this one comes as a surprise, right? Quake III Arena was the hot title of 1999, though it was not without controversy. As the game's title implies, Quake III Arena ditched the single-player campaign to focus on multiplayer. Its software justified this by delivering what it promised: insanely quick online deathmatch action, though you could still play with bots if your mom had to use the phone. There's just one reason why Quake 3 isn't higher on this list, and that's actually the focus on deathmatch. By 1999, multiplayer shooter fans were starting to lean towards team-based game modes with more complex mechanics, class systems, and even vehicles. Quake 3 did not fully embrace this trend until the release of the Quake 3 Team Arena expansion in the following year. Because of that, I think the game's legacy has more to do with its tech than its gameplay. Quake 3 required an OpenGL-compatible 3D accelerator to run, and it was one of the first games to do so. The game's engine, known as id Tech 3, also had spline-based curved surfaces to add convincing curves to level geometry. Now, this was a very novel feature at the time, and the game's attractive maps used it to great effect. id Tech 3 was really the gold standard for 3D geometry in 1999, and it showed PC gamers that blocky 3D models and terrain would soon be a thing of the past. Age of Empires 2 is a game that seems to age like fine wine. It still ranks among the most popular strategy games on Steam today. I think it all boils down to the core concept. Age of Empires was built to replicate the scope and feel of Sid Meier's Civilization, but in a real-time game. The original did a decent job of that, but Age of Empires 2 refined the idea by focusing on a smaller slice of history and filing off the original's rough edges like bad unit AI. The result is a timeless game that's just as fun to play today as it was back in 1999. The game's influence can be found in a wide range of titles from Stronghold to Rise of Nations and Empire Earth. Age of Empires 2 proved that players were still interested in games based on real-world history, an idea that was in some dispute, as hordes of games set in sci-fi and fantasy worlds swarmed the PC gaming market in 1999.
And if you want to know more about Age of Empires, I have an entire video dedicated exclusively to the franchise. There's information there like how Ensemble Studios was formed, why the game engine came about the way it did, how it was modified for Age of Empires 2, and why Ensemble Studios decided to go a different direction with Age of Empires 3, among a lot of other in-depth information. And of course, if you like this video, go ahead and give it a like. And if you like what you see a lot, you go ahead and subscribe. You're going to find a lot more videos like this in the future. Plus, if you really want to help out, there is a Patreon that you'll find linked in this video's description, as well as the About page of this YouTube channel, so you can check that out. And speaking of Patreon, I'd like to give a shout out to the 3 current subscribers. That would be A Simple Device, Kale, and Matthias from Sweden. So thank you very much for all of your support. You're in on the ground level, so very exciting stuff. Anyway, let's get on with this list, shall we? We are going straight to number 5.
What do I care for your suffering? Pain, even agony, is no more than information before the senses.
Game designer Sid Meier was something of a minor celebrity in the mid-90s, hot off the success of the Civilization franchise, but all was not well at Microprose, the studio he helped to co-found. An acquisition left him and several other developers, including Brian Reynolds, unhappy, so they left, and they formed Firaxis Games in 1997. They immediately leapt into Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri, a game that began with a question most players of Civilization 2 had asked themselves at some point. What exactly happens to the colony ship if you win a science victory in Civilization 2? Well, it turns out the answer is that they fly off to an alien world and start the 4X formula all over again. Now, Sid Meier's name is on the box, but the design was actually a team effort led by Brian Reynolds, who was lead designer on Civilization 2. Yet the game is definitely a lot more than just civilization and space. It established a terraforming weather and climate system that made city improvements very complex. The game also had an unusual non-linear tech tree and extensive unit customization. Alpha Centauri also doubles down on the writing and presentation of the game, which is a big improvement from Civilization 2. Alpha Centauri set a standard for future 4X games with leaders and factions that had far more personality than any game prior in the genre. Massively multiplayer games were already on the up by 1999 thanks to Ultima Online, but Everquest was the genre's first smash hit. The game's massive 3D world drew in thousands of players on release despite severe connection issues that made the game difficult to play for weeks after launch. The game ended up with over 100,000 subscribers in its first few months and would go on to over 400,000 at its peak, roughly doubling the numbers that Ultima Online achieved. But it wasn't just subscriber counts that made Everquest stand out. It was among the first PC games to have an open, fully 3D world that players could explore at their leisure, and unlike Ultima Online, it didn't lean on player versus player combat or dynamic player-driven mechanics. Progression was really the point of the game, and it's the progenitor of the so-called theme park style of MMO, which dominated not only future MMOs but also leaked into single-player gaming. Everquest also had a hefty and direct influence on the development of World of Warcraft, as several developers came to Blizzard's project with experience raiding in Everquest. Now, the game has, of course, faded as newer, more refined MMOs arrived over the years, but it does maintain a small subscriber base that, as of the most recent count, numbers around 60,000 players, and it still receives regular expansions. That is certainly something you can't say for most games released in 1999. The release of Unreal in 1998 finally gave shooter fans a game that could visually rival the best from id Software, but despite solid critical reception, it did have a bit of a problem. The netcode was kinda crap. 1999's Unreal Tournament was Epic's apology. Like Quake III Arena, it ditched a single-player campaign and focused all its attention on the fragging. At its core, Unreal Tournament leaned towards deathmatch, but it also offered assault, capture the flag, domination, and last man standing modes. These modes were enhanced by some truly iconic maps, like Facing Worlds, which pit two teams manning two towers on an asteroid in a face-to-face battle that favored players skilled with a sniper rifle. Of course, Unreal's true legacy was ultimately the game engine, which Epic sold as a commercial product. The success of Unreal Tournament proved the engine was ideal for not only single-player games but also multiplayer games, and it soon became the go-to option for studios that didn't want to build a 3D engine in-house. And well, I guess you could say they have had some success. Half-Life sent shockwaves through the video game industry, but it did have a major weakness: multiplayer. Valve was aware of this and soon hired on the creators of the popular Quake mod, Team Fortress. In 1999, a version of their mod was released as a free update to Half-Life. Team Fortress innovated on deathmatch, not only with objective-based modes like Capture the Flag, which were common in other games, but also with a class system that had unique weapons and perks for each class. Now, this was not unheard of in 1999. Star Siege Tribes had been released a prior year after all, but stuffing Team Fortress into a free update for 1998's best shooter made it a guaranteed hit. In fact, this turned out to be a real galaxy brain move by Valve. In one stroke, it converted the fanbase of a popular Quake mod into dedicated Half-Life players, just as id Software geared up to launch its brand new shooter Quake III. I think this had a big impact on Quake III's long-term popularity and feeds into why the eventual release of Quake III Team Arena was received with so much negative attention. In any case, the success of Team Fortress left an obvious impression on multiplayer shooters as a whole. It proved what developers were beginning to suspect: that team objective modes, not deathmatch, was the key to mainstream appeal. Nearly all later multiplayer shooters, from Call of Duty to Battlefield and Return to Castle Wolfenstein, would center on team-based objectives instead of old-school fragfests. Yep, it turns out the two best games from 1999 are Half-Life mods. But with that said, the origins of Counter-Strike are a bit different from Team Fortress. The tactical first-person shooter genre was becoming a thing in the mid to late 1990s with the release of games like Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six, Spec Ops: Rangers Lead the Way, and Delta Force. Min Lee and Jeff Cliff, the key developers behind the mod, drew inspiration from these games to create their own original mod for Half-Life, and they released it into beta in June of 1999. Unlike Team Fortress, it was not an instant hit, but the mod's popularity grew as the months went by and the modders released improvements. Valve was still eager to bolster the multiplayer community for Half-Life, and seeing the popularity of Counter-Strike, they decided to bring the modders on board. Now, Counter-Strike's brilliance is in its simplicity. I put quite a few hours into the original Rainbow Six back in the day, and I enjoyed every minute of it, but it was a slow and methodical game that was very much focused on realism. Players spent as much time planning an operation as they did shooting it out. Counter-Strike distilled the idea into quick matches anyone could pick up and enjoy within just a few minutes. The success of Counter-Strike pushed the shooter genre away from the sci-fi trappings of Unreal and Quake and towards franchises that were, at least on the surface, based on contemporary warfare. It would also become a foundational esports title, and it continues to dominate the Steam most played charts to this day. Counter-Strike is not just the best game of 1999, but in a list of best games ever made, well, it would have a very strong chance of taking the top spot.
Alright, that's it, the best PC games of 1999. Please leave your comments if you have some different opinions on this one. I'm sure there's going to be a few. And if you liked this video, make sure you give it a like. And if you really liked it, be sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.